Hello and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Drea Renee Knits, and this is a little weekly podcast where I try my best to answer some of your questions. Usually we focus on knitting, but you never know what we might end up chatting about. Sometimes spinning, fiber, who knows? The world is our oyster. Today I am wearing the Pumped Up Cowl. This is one of my absolute favorite styles of cowl. If you've been following me for a while, you know I have quite a few patterns with this shape, and I love this one. So this is 2-color brioche, and I used Spin Cycle Yarn's plump yarn. And I don't do a lot of bulky knitting. I think we just tend to, hey, some of us have a favorite color and it's the one we choose again and again. Some of us, like myself, want to use all the colors. Some of us in knitting end up finding that sweet spot with our yarn. And while I like to use all the colors, I do tend to stick to like sport weight, fingering weight, maybe a little DK and worsted. But I don't venture highly, to the big ends. I don't tend to do lace very much unless I'm holding it with something else. And I don't tend to do a lot of bulky. I think you just find your groove and you know what you know. It's like going to your favorite restaurant and you just know that one dish that you love, and you could try something else and it might be just as good, but you're like, ooh, but if it's not, then I just missed out on the one I know I love. So anyways, this was all that to say, this is a really good exercise for me to like step out of my comfy zone and dig into something a little more squishy. And I have to say, I absolutely love the structure of it. I like that I feel cocooned and just, ooh, so cozy. So anyways, that's what I'm wearing today. And I think that's all we got for the front of this podcast. Let's go ahead and jump into some questions. So question number 1's about soaking and blocking a newly finished object. All right, I just finished Thru Lines for the March2May knit along. Yay! And your instructions said to soak for 15 minutes. I believe in some previous podcasts that you mentioned that you have your new FOs soak in hot water until the water cools down, which would be much longer than 15 minutes. You are correct. Are there advantages or disadvantages to soaking for longer than 15 minutes? Should certain types of yarn or FOs be soaked longer? Thank you. Such a great question. So yes, I have spoken on here about how I like to block or wash my hand knits, and it's a little taboo. If you read any yarn label, 99.9% of them are going to tell you to soak in cool water, not hot. So there are reasons I do it the way I do it. There are reasons I write it a certain way in my patterns, and there are reasons why other people would tell you to do it differently. So let's have a little chitty chat about blocking. So personally, I believe it is important to soak the yarn to the core. If you only throw your knit into the sink, maybe you give it a couple squishies and then you pull it back out and lay it out to dry, it's not really going to reach its potential. If you haven't fully soaked that yarn, it's not gonna bloom the way it could. It's not gonna get zhuzhed and evened out really the way it could with a full soak. At least in my experience, and especially if you're using animal fibers like wool. So I do want to thoroughly soak that yarn. Now, I think that can be done in 15 minutes, absolutely, unless it's a super thick yarn. But super thick yarn might be one of the times that I actually wouldn't want to do a full soak. I wouldn't want it to get soaked to the core, because sometimes those yarns actually have a little trouble completely drying. So for instance, my friend Amy, who owns Knit Collage Yarns, she really recommends doing more of like a steam block on her yarns and not fully saturating them, because a lot of her yarns are bulky, super bulky. They are kind of like a coarse spun. They're really dense and they just have trouble fully drying again. So that could be a reason why maybe you don't want to over soak them. But in general, especially with the yarn thicknesses I tend to use and the fibers I tend to use, which tend to be wool, animal fibers. I really do like a full soak. I want it to be saturated from the core on out, and then I like to let it really fully dry. And that's when you can get that really lovely like poof, that bloom on your yarn where it fills in and gets extra squishy. Now let's talk a little bit about water temperature. There is a reason, absolutely, that a lot of yarn labels are going to tell you to do cool or lukewarm or tepid water, and that is because they don't want the color to bleed on you. And what can create a good environment for your colors to bleed in your yarn is warmer water. And the reason for that is that, again, animal fibers that have those little scales on them, just like our hair does, when they are put into warm or hot water, it makes the cuticle, those little scales, open. And that's ideal for getting color in or out of something. So like when we're dyeing our hair, we want it to get warm when we're trying to get the color in there. But if you've ever colored your hair and you've had your hairdresser, then like maybe they even put you under a heat lamp for a little bit to help process your color. But then when they rinse it out, maybe they do a cool water, which can be kind of jarring. It's because they're trying to close that cuticle back down and keep that color in there. So when yarn, we can kind of think about it the same way. In a twofold situation, if you're working on a multicolored project and you have a very light yarn and then a very saturated yarn, so let's just say red and white. If you do a hot water bath, not only is it opening the cuticle on the red yarn and maybe letting some of that color out, it's also opening the cuticle on the white yarn and possibly letting some of that color in. Cold water is going to help keep those cuticles closed, and the chance for color bleeding is going to be reduced. Now, personally, I have only ever had an issue once, and a good way to know if you do need to be cautious about colors bleeding if you're doing a multicolored project is to swatch your block. Whoop! Swatch your block! Block your swatch. Because it's a perfect little example. Block it just how you want to block your finished object. So maybe if you do want to do a hotter bath, try that out with your swatch, and then you know, oh, I see some color bleeding, or nope, I'm all good. I'm not going to have to worry about my bigger project. Some people just default to cold water, and that's totally fine. You do you. You can also always throw in a little splash of vinegar or a color catcher if you are worried about things like color bleeding. So now let's talk about why I use hot water instead of cold water when I'm blocking. So again, generally speaking, I use a lot of wool when I knit. That is the primary yarn I'm knitting is wool yarn. And I have found that doing warmer water helps soften the yarn more, and I think that I get a better bloom with my blocking after a hot water bath than keeping that water cool. So especially if I'm not worried about color, my favorite method is to let the bath be as hot as my sink gets. I'll fill it up. I do a little wool wash, no rinse wool wash, and I put my woolen in there and I let it soak until that water cools off, just like the person asking this question had heard. And only when that water is cool do I get my hands in there. You know, I drain the water, squeeze out the excess, and go from there. So again, I find that the hot water softens up my knits. It does something nice to the lanolin. I don't know. Just a little bit of magic that I have found. But I definitely don't get my hands in there and agitate what I am blocking, because the other thing that you do have to be careful about is you don't want to felt anything. So that's where so the fear of hot water in your woolens comes from felting or color bleeding. So to felt something, you want hot, you want that heat, and a lot of times even you want to go from extreme temperature to extreme. So if we are purposely felting something, we might actually be going from like hot water to cold water and shocking it. And that helps those fibers start to grip onto each other along with agitation. So though that combination is what's going to felt something, lock it up, it's going to shrink down, and it's going to become basically a solid fabric that you would not be able to open up again. Now, generally speaking, we're not trying to felt our sweaters and our shawls and whatnot. And so we want to be really careful if we do choose to use hot water. I don't stick my hands in there. I'm not agitating it at all. I literally just put my knit in there and let it soak. So I don't have to worry about it felting if I'm not getting in there and agitating and moving it around. Just setting it gently into the hot water bath. I've never had anything felt. So, I'm really going on with this one. But the last part of this question is the directions in my patterns. So I do always give a little brief summary of how to block something, and I do say to soak for 15 minutes. So why do I say 15 minutes in there if I let my items soak longer? Because what I have found is that there are definitely knitters out there who blocking is a bit of a roadblock for them, just like swatching can be. Sometimes it's the step that we just don't want to fiddle with. And so I would much rather get people to soak their item for a quick 15, because that can saturate it enough. And if you're not using super hot water, like, you know, you can do a lukewarm bath. It's going to be cool enough that you're going to get it out of there. You're not going to over agitate it. And it's going to be fine. And your item's going to look great. You don't need to soak it for a super duper long time. 15 minutes is a great, like, if I do it for this, it's probably going to be soaked right through to the core, and that's great. So that is just basic blocking instructions to get people finishing their knits, because I personally don't think knits are finished until you do that final step. They really need to be blocked for you to see the final result in all its glory, because after blocking, your stitches even out. The yarn blooms, it softens, the drape is there, lace and cables open. I've told this story before, but I'll never forget when, 15, 20 years ago now, I knit a cable cardigan. It was long. It's like a hip length, longer than hip length cardigan. I didn't block it. And I was like, this thing looks like crud on me. And I gave it away. And oh, that poor sweater. If I had just blocked it, I would have realized that it would have relaxed, the cables would have opened, and it wouldn't have been this lumpy bumpy mess that it was pre-blocking. So blocking is important, and I want people to do it to really see the full beauty of their knits. So those are the instructions I give in the patterns. I think we all find the methods that work really well for us, and I'm not necessarily always, depending on the project, how much time I have, things like that, I might adjust how I'm going to block something. But a lot of times too, a longer soak works for me just because I get something in the bath and I forget about it for a while. Like this morning, I just finished up a little project for a new workshop that I'm developing, and I threw the little project in the bath and then I went and did my workout. So it doesn't have, there's nothing that says you better pull that out in 15 minutes. Like, letting it soak longer is not an issue, but I just wouldn't do really under 15 minutes because I want it to soak through to the core. So there is my very, very long spiel on blocking and water temps and timing. All right, let's get on to question number 2. I just purchased yarn from North Bay Fiber for your Comebackigan cardigan, and I was wondering if you alternate the skeins due to it being hand dyed. So dealer's choice, I do not love alternating skeins. I will only do it if I really feel like it's necessary. I don't know why. You know, we just talked about sometimes we have mental roadblocks that make us procrastinate or avoid swatching and blocking, things like that. For me, that is alternating skeins. I don't know why I avoid it and really don't like doing it. But I only want to stripe if I want stripes. I don't like having to fiddle. I mean, I know some people who always alternate skeins with everything. Now, there are times where it's necessary, and I just think it depends on the yarn you're using. And even from the same dyer, you might find that some skeins are super similar. You don't need to worry about alternating skeins. And then with others, you might find that you do. So I would just look at them. And if you have any inkling that you're going to get a line of demarcation that's going to show when you switch skeins, alternate, because it's even more annoying. Even for me, I would much rather alternate than get down like 3 or 4 inches from where I changed skeins and be like, oh, there is a super noticeable difference, which I've had happen. I have learned my lesson. So quick recap though, what am I talking about? What are we talking about with alternating skeins? So alternating skeins, we do this with hand dyed yarn. Typically, you don't usually need to do this with commercially dyed yarn because it's just different. There's usually more consistency in a commercially dyed yarn, where in an indie dyed yarn, a lot of times the way the yarn is dyed, it's in pots, and the color might be a little more saturated in one area than another. Sometimes they're more tonal, where it's not just a super solid color all the way through. It's more variegated. Even though it's one color, you're going to see some light areas and some dark areas. So when we are knitting with skeins like that, what we might find is one skein's just a titch darker or lighter than the next skein we're going to use. So if we just knit them like, oh, I used up all this skein, now I'm going to pull in my new skein of yarn and start knitting with that. Well, all of a sudden, maybe we're doing a top-down sweater. Let's say Comebackigan's bottom-up. Let's say a bottom-up sweater. So we have this strip here, and then all of a sudden you notice like a line, like a stripe of where it's a little bit lighter or darker above it. And it just looks, it ends up looking almost like you used yarn from two different dye lots. So a way to soften that line of demarcation, to avoid that hard line of a color change, is that you would just do some striping. So you would alternate your yarn every other row for a few inches to blend from one skein to the next. And then you won't notice this big hard line where it looks like you have a stripe of slightly darker yarn, then a stripe of slightly lighter yarn, something like that. So I have had to do it. In the Comebackigan, I knit two. I know I did not have to alternate with Holly. With the red one, I didn't alternate. I knit that one second. The first one I knit was Mallard, and I maybe did a little on one sleeve. I felt like I was getting a little bit of a line, so maybe I did a couple stripes there, but I definitely didn't do it throughout the whole project that I remember. But your choice. If you are worried about it, then just do it, and then you have peace of mind. You could always do that as you move from skein to skein. Just do like 2 inches of striping or maybe even an inch. I mean, again, your choice. The nice thing is too, is the texture. You could probably get away with doing a little bit less of alternating because of the texture in there. Now, some people, if they're alternating skeins, will literally use 2 skeins at the same time, going every other row, and they'll stripe the whole thing. I just don't love doing it. I don't know why. Like, why do I have such a thing? But if you're noticing some variation in your skeins and you're worried about it, then I would say to do it, because it's a lot nicer to have done it and be really happy with your cardigan than to avoid it and either not be happy or have to tear back to fix it. So there you go. Okay. And I do know, like, certain yarn companies too, I've even seen that on a label, or they'll say it in like a yarn description where they even recommend alternating skeins. A lot of yarn companies are pretty good about saying that, like, in a larger project, we recommend alternating skeins. So always kind of look at your yarn too and see if they recommend it. That can be a nice little cue for you, so you can know, like, okay, I should probably do it with this project. All right, question number 3. You mentioned woolen spun yarn in Friday's podcast. Can you address the difference between woolen and worsted spun yarn? How can you tell the difference when buying yarn, and which type of yarn works best for what kind of project? Okay, so I have talked about this on here before, but I feel like it's a good one. I feel like I know that when I first started exploring like my local yarn store for years, it's a lot to learn. It's a lot to start to understand what makes one yarn different than another yarn. I feel the same way. I wish I'm always seeking out this kind of information with fabric, because I feel like when I sew, I'm still such a novice with fabric, and I'm like, well, I don't know what makes this different than this one. So this is something that I kind of enjoy reviewing, because I think it can be really helpful. It can, especially if you're going to substitute yarns, because subbing a woolen spun yarn for a worsted or vice versa is going to give you a different outcome. It's also going to change the weight of the sweater or the thing that you're knitting. And I think that is where people sometimes end up under or over buying yarn because they don't realize that they're using a different spin on their yarn, which affects how heavy it is. So you might have the same yardage, but it's going to weigh a lot less if it's woolen spun compared to worsted spun. So let's jump into what their differences are. Woolen spun, basically what that means is when that yarn is spun, the fibers before they are spun are all jumbled up. They're not smooth and combed out like a ponytail. They're gnarly. They're all jumbled up, and then they are spun in a way that keeps them jumbled up so that there is actually air in the middle of that yarn, and it's lofty and light. It's also very warm. It does a really good job of insulating us, because what happens when we wear a garment that has been knit out of a woolen spun yarn is our body heat warms up that core of air in that yarn and keeps us warmer. So it is all jumbled up fibers, which helps create this really lofty spin. It's also spun in a way, because they're all jumbled up like that, it tends to have a gentler spin, maybe not as much twist as a worsted spun yarn. So it's not going to be as strong or hard wearing as a worsted spun. So things that I love to use woolen spun for: hats, shawls, sweaters, mittens, although I do keep in mind that they are not as hard wearing, so it depends what I'm going to use those mittens for, how hard I'm going to be on them. I would not use a woolen spun yarn for socks. The chance of that getting a hole real fast is high. So I'm going to use it for things that I want them to be warmer, that I want them to be lightweight, and that I know I'm wearing it in a place where it's not going to meet a ton of abrasion and wear out super quickly. Worsted spun yarn is yarn that all the fibers are lined up, are combed to all, like if you comb out your hair, all the same direction, and smoothed out. And then as they're spun, they are again smoothed and the air is compressed out as it is spun into a yarn. Generally speaking, worsted spun yarns, another thing about woolen spun is they have more of a matte finish because of all the jumbled fibers. This is not like, I don't mean this in a negative way, but they're duller. They don't have the shine. So depending on what kind of look you're going for, I really like matte. So I like the look of a matte yarn. Okay, back to worsted spun. Worsted spun, because everything is combed in the same direction, it's smoothed as it goes, it's gonna generally have more sheen, more shine to it. It's going to be stronger, and I already said smoother, maybe a little drapier. It's also going to be a lot heavier because the air has been pressed out of it. So there's more fiber in the diameter of that yarn. Even if it's the same thickness as a woolen spun yarn, there's more fiber concentrated into the worsted spun than the woolen spun. So it's literally heavier than your woolen spun yarn. Worsted spun yarns are really a workhorse for anything. That is where I would choose for my socks, and it's going to be more hard wearing, can look a little fancier. So if I was doing a shawl for, say, a wedding or something, I'd probably want to go worsted spun. And there you go. I mean, is there anything else I need to say? That's kind of the gist of the two of them. I'm sure there's a lot more that can be said. There's been books written on it, but that's kind of a quick sum up. How can you tell which is which? So again, there's some visual cues. One is the shine versus the matte finish. A lot of times a woolen spun yarn will have that stated on the label. I would say that there are more worsted spun yarns available in stores, at least in the US. I would say, like, if I went into a yarn shop, most of the yarns would be worsted spun. So the ones that are woolen spun, a lot of times they kind of mention that because it makes them stand out, makes them special, because they're not quite so prevalent. And then you could always ask. or look up online. Sometimes you'll find more of a yarn description online than if you were in a store. A lot of times, especially smaller yarn producers are going to say, they're going to do a little description of if it's superwash or non-superwash, if it's woolen, spun, if it's, you know, grown here, milled here, etc. So there you go. Hopefully I covered most of the things there. All right, question number 4. I was curious about how you go about blocking cardigans or sweaters when they need to be pinned to measurements. Trying to fiddle the back and front sleeves and shoulders to be evenly tensioned and non-wonky takes me forever, and usually ends with a cigarette, glass of wine, and I'm never doing this again attitude. Is there a perfectionist way to do it? Top down, bottom up, shoulders first, removable stitch markers, etc. that can help me not pull out the rest of my hair? Or is it a this is good enough situation for everyone? So personally, I do not pin any of my sweaters. The only reason I think I would pin a sweater is if I am blocking it before picking up stitches for a button band or before seaming, because my edges might roll. And then I'm probably not gonna be over fiddling. I'm just trying to get that edge straight enough because I know I'm then going to seam or pick up stitches and I'm gonna have to block the whole thing again. So my goal there is more, let's get these edges so that they lay flat enough to make my next step easier. Reasons why you would maybe need to use blocking pins and whatnot for a garment would be if you need to open up lace. I could see that. But otherwise, because sweaters need to be washed more often, we wear them more, we wear them in a way that, you know, we've got underarms. They're going to get funky. We need to wash them more often than, say, a cowl or a shawl, which we may only ever wash the once. So I don't really want to include things in my sweaters that would be that finicky when I block them, because I'm going to wash them too much to have to deal with that every time. So there's that. So I'm going to relate this more to a shawl. If I was doing a shawl, I definitely had to use blocking wires and pins for shawls, especially if they have lace in them and I'm trying to open it up. And what I do is I put myself in the mindset of this is this important special step to help this reach perfection, and I am going to view it the same way as I do my knitting. I try to put myself in a relaxing mood. I put on an audio book or a podcast or whatever floats your boat, and just know it's not going to take 5 minutes. It's going to take an hour. It's going to take time. And I think when we set ourselves up to know, oh, this is another part of the process that's going to take time, then we don't rush it and like, oh, I just want to be done with this. And I would say, as far as a plan of attack, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll kind of get the general shape going. And then I will go through and make the minor adjustments to make it perfect. So get it into its general shape. Then you can go through and pull a little more, tighten it a little more, create more tension. Because the only reason you'll need to be using blocking pins or wires or things like that is because you need tension on the piece to hold it open, so that it blocks the way you need it to. Now, you've probably seen in most sweater patterns will tell you to block to the schematic. That, generally speaking, if you had gauge, shouldn't mean that you, again, need those pins and wires. You can do that just by laying it flat to dry and doing some minor adjustments with your hands. Or a little bit of pinning if you need to, but it shouldn't be a big thing, again, unless you're doing lace and stuff like that. So if anybody else has a method to the madness when they are doing maybe a more high maintenance blocking, please feel free to share, because it's always nice to get tips. And sometimes people find like a rhythm that just works really well and brings the joy back in for them. And so if we can share that, that's so helpful. I love when I figure out like a little key to, oh, this made this better for me. And with blocking, it was one. I always just, there are certain things that I think are, okay, I'm almost done. This will take me a minute. Like a bind off. Sometimes we're like, oh, I'm about to bind off. This will just take me a couple minutes. And 30 to 45 minutes later, we're like, oh my gosh, I'm still binding this thing off. So I think recognizing in our mind, like, this is going to take the time it takes and it's not going to be 2 seconds. When we set ourselves up for like, okay, I'm just going to relax into this. I'm going to pour myself a cup of tea and put on my favorite thing to listen to. And I'm just going to get in the rhythm and really enjoy looking at this beautiful thing I just finished making, and enjoying it while I pin it out to perfection. Pin to perfection. Okay, last question. I would love to knit your new Come Back Again and wonder if it would be possible to reverse engineer the pattern and knit it from the top down. Is there anything to be aware of? I'm more confident knitting from the top, though I've knitted some of your bottom up sweaters as well. But I've never done the sleeves first and attached them to the body before starting raglan decreases. So I'm a tiny bit intimidated by that. Okay, so if I can help take any intimidation out of the joining the sleeves, all you're doing, you've put your sleeves on hold and then knit the body, and then all you're doing is putting them all onto a needle together. So there's nothing super fancy happening there or tricky to join. You just start working them all together. So you're gonna like knit across this part to get the cardigan, add your sleeve, work across the back, add your other sleeve, work across the front, and then go back the other way. And you're just gonna do that, and then you'll have decreases here at the raglan. That's gonna bring it all together. And it'll get less and less awkward as you knit because it's gonna get smaller and smaller and more manageable. Full, what's the word? Clarity? I don't know. Full behind the scenes look. I actually knit my first Come Back Again from the top down. My intention was that it was going to be a top down pattern. Where I ran into a stumbling block was I try really, really hard to never make anyone guess what to do in my patterns and to keep them as accessible as possible to different levels of expertise as knitters. So again, I try hard to not make you guess. And as I was knitting mine, how I do it is when I'm designing a pattern, I do the math, I come up with the rough plan, and then as I'm knitting, any little details I need perfectly, I type them out as I go, or write them in a digital notebook. And typically what happens with the pattern, if I don't already know the repeat, depending on how complicated the pattern is, I will write line by line until I see, oh, I am now repeating. So now I know, here's my repeat to get me through this shaping, for instance. And the Come Back Again, it's not a super tricky stitch pattern. It's a 4-stitch repeat. It's just knits and purls. But what I found is I try really hard to make my rate of shaping for raglans to fit well. And that means that it's not just a increase every other round till you get done with the yoke and then you're good, because I don't think that necessarily creates the best balance between the size of the sleeve and the size of the body, and especially across different sizes. Sometimes there's different things that need to happen shaping wise. So what I found with the Come Back Again is, even when I was knitting mine, which was fairly straightforward, I didn't have to do a lot of shaping gymnastics, I still had to write out every line. There was no easy repeat that happened. So I was like, okay, this isn't falling into one of those clean repeat situations. So I'm gonna chart it so that we have a visual, and that might also show, okay, here we go. Here's a repeat we could start to put in here. Nope, that didn't happen. So we realized very quickly, with the help of my tech editor, I was like, hey, she is a whiz at charting and things like that. So I was like, if you have the time, can you help me chart with the sizes? Here's the written for everybody. Here's the math, all the stuff. So she gets back to me and she's like, okay, for just the size 3, we're looking at a full page chart for this yoke. And by the time we get up to the size 10, we're looking at charts that are spanning multiple pages. This was going to turn into a 50-page pattern. And it was very quickly just becoming too confusing when you looked at it. And again, the only option, I had two options. I could make the instructions more vague and say, this is what, stay in pattern, and just hope people knew how to stay in pattern, which a lot of knitters would probably feel comfortable with that. But I don't like leaving that to chance if I can help it. I want to give I want it to be relaxing and joyful. And some people love the challenge, but not everyone does. So anyways, long story long, I realized if I changed from increasing top down to decreasing bottom up, it is so much easier for people to stay in pattern without me holding their hand, because you can literally look below your work and you know how to stay in pattern as you're decreasing stitches out in a way that's a lot more intuitive. So I actually had to reverse engineer the pattern to make it bottom up. So all that to say, it can be knit from the top down, but the only way I could really answer that is you would have to be comfortable reverse engineering a pattern and staying in pattern while increasing without those directions being explicitly spelled out for you. So there you go. I always say, if you feel comfortable and you feel excited about the challenge, then do it. If you're like, oh, I would rather tackle my fear of joining the sleeves to the yoke and just knowing you're telling me exactly what to do, then stick with the pattern as it was written. But it's your adventure. I myself have done it. I have altered patterns to be what I wanted them to be so I could knit them the way I wanted to. And it was a really fun challenge, but that's not for everybody. So it's always choose your own adventure. You know best. So there you go. Whatever you do, best of luck. I hope that you love it. Okay. I think this is everything. I can't believe we're into May. Where is this year going? It is just screaming by. So I hope that you have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. This one got a little long. If you have a question, please feel free to click the link below. This is the last month of our March to May knit along and our May knitting challenge knit along. Kind of said that funny. It's going to be here before we know it. We got photos. That pattern's almost ready. I can't wait to share it with you all. So in the meantime, I hope you have the loveliest of weekends, and I hope to see you back here next week. Happy making.